first of our people and environment talks that we'll be doing in 2021, kicking off with Ashraful, which we're very grateful to have you here, Ash. And we have I think, pretty much full program for the rest of the year. Somebody scheduled for every week. So we'll be announcing those with reasonable regularity. Lots of exciting discussion. Cecily's just jumped into the chat there. Cecily Miller, who's my co-convener in the People and Environment Program in the Centre for Urban Research. So welcome from the both of us. I want to begin by acknowledging the people of the Woiwurrung and Boonwurrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nations, on whose unceded land RMIT conducts the business of the university, and whose land I am on today, and to recognise elders and ancestors past and present. And just to add to that a tiny bit, I wanted to just quickly share this little thing which I've pasted into the chat. A nice little article in light of Earth Day, calling for land back rather than Earth Day, and as a kind of a counter to a more corporatized notion of Earth Day from the NDN collective. So have a little look at that if you're interested. Yeah, quite a timely little piece that's been getting a little bit of play, and a really interesting little movement too. So I won't talk for too much longer, but as I said, we've got Ash joining us. Ash is a lecturer in the School of Geography at the University of Otago, and very helpfully, University of Otago have an excellent profile page for their academics, some of the best I've seen. So just a quick background on Ash. His research interests fall under a broad umbrella of urban and cultural geography and planning. He's interested in structural dynamics of place creating, otherness, othering, and enabling more subaltern and informal infrastructural politics, which we'll get a little sense of today. And has a strong research focused on marginalisation and people who are less represented in a range of different ways, forums, including more than human research as well. And also to note that Ash won the Geography Society New South Wales photo competition in 2017. So that's a nice little tidbit I learned today, Ash. Must be a good photographer as well. So anyway, I'll leave the floor to you, Ash. Please take it away, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Ben, for the nice introduction. Kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. So many thanks to Ben and Cecilia for inviting me into this space, and the PEP Talk is indeed a cool initiative, and I very much look forward to seeing how this space pan out, and I definitely want to be stay connected with this in coming months. So in relation to what we are going to see today, so in today's presentation, I will take you through 3 housing sites in 3 different cities to explain how and why I call for reimagining shadow infrastructures. So you'll see in a minute that in all 3 cases, my participants struggle to access housing resources because of their inherent informal characteristics in those housing channels. However, I will try to argue that enacting shadow relations that I will start to call as shadow infrastructures will help these marginalized actors derive benefit and some degrees of ontological security in each of these housing scenarios. But please know that this is a work in progress, and as it happens with all kind of works in progress, that I'm not really sure in terms of conceptually how I am progressing. So happy to take on board some of your comments and feedback. But I must also acknowledge one thing at the beginning, that I was grateful to have Emma Power contacted me last week and sharing their paper on care as what's that, shadow care infrastructure, which is a forthcoming paper, and it was really helpful. And this paper is coming from, this paper is going to be authored by Emma Power, Kathy Mee, and Ilan Weisel. So thanks, Emma, for sharing that. It really helped to sort of like wrap together this presentation today. So in terms of, let me introduce some of the key concepts to situate my presentation, to contextualize it in terms of how I approach infrastructure. So there has been a growing interest in the everyday experiences of urban infrastructures over their stereotypical imagery that are linked to technology and physical forms. These works basically suggest that beyond their material configurations, infrastructures have social, political, and symbolic lives. Especially critical urban scholars like Stephen Graham, Colin McFarlane, Ash Amin, and our own Jago Dodson call this new focus on the socio-technical as the infrastructural term. Lauren Berland of the University of Chicago, Australian scholars David Wissel and Gillian Fuller, they take inspiration from the new materialism and post-humanism philosophies to highlight the performative and relationally constituted processes of infrastructures. And these works resonate well with some earlier works in the 1990s. For example, the works by Susan Leigh Starr. Starr provoked to rethink infrastructures as ethnographic sites. And another interesting and inspiring work from early 2000 is by Abdul Malik Simon, which has been quite inspirational for me. So Simon extends the notion of infrastructures directly to people's activities in the city. Based on his works on African cities, he argued that for increasing numbers of urban Africans, their cities no longer offered them the prospect of improving their livelihoods. Instead, the informal collaborations among urban residents supported their survivals. And in that sense, those people and their social relations became infrastructure. So building on these works, Donna Hoston of Macquarie University, who was my PhD supervisor as well, and Donna and I published a paper in Cities Journal last year. We basically brought together works by Simon and Berland, and some of the recent works by on feminist care ethics by Kathleen Mee, Emma Power, and Miriam Williams, who build on Joan Tronto's architecture of care. We were particularly interested in Joan Tronto's fifth phase of care, caring with. Caring with recognizes the agencies of care receivers who must actively participate in and acknowledge the work of care for any care work to be successful. So caring with, in this sense, helps recognize both intrahuman and more than human social relations in any care setting. So building on this conceptualization of caring with, in our paper, we proposed the framework of care collectives that do not, at least the way we were trying to conceptualize, that do not make any distinctions between haves and haves not. And with that framework of care collectives, we analyzed everyday non-institutional care spaces in different cities to show care relations can form alternative forms of infrastructures. For example, you can see in this photograph those pop-up libraries for kids or community fruit and veggie stands that are all over New Zealand. So this is the conceptual backdrop of how I start to think about shadow infrastructures. And now I'm going to change the tune from theories to case studies. And in the past few years, I have been examining different housing sites in Bangladesh and Sydney, and now I'm expanding my work to New Zealand. So I'll be taking you through 3 case studies. So case study 1, perhaps this is familiar with some of you if you have been through my PhD thesis or some of the presentations during my PhD. So the first case study is from Khulna, Bangladesh, focused on the research focus was on how non-human agencies such as plants and animals of urban ecologies have helped floating migrants, especially migrant women, negotiate housing and a sense of belonging in the new urban environment. So perhaps here you can, in the slide, you can see one shelter. There is another shelter in the distance. And we were basically looking into these peri-urban fringes. In these 12 locations, those are still agricultural lands. Basically, these lands are waiting to be urbanized. And these lands are owned by powerful elites. But these are still informal settlements in a sense. I mean, these are not those spectacular kind of informal settlements we often come to know as slums. Instead, these are vacant farmlands, and outside of the urban core, the shelters or the housing sites are quite dispersed. So what happens, landless rural migrants can access to these shelters at the corner of those agricultural land. And if they are only willing to give agricultural services to those absentee patrons, and some families are living in this way as long as like 25 to 30 years without any formal agreement. And in that sense, these are informal settlements. And statistically, these spaces are defined in the planning documents. They're other urban areas, so they do not really have any name. So here I present one outcome of one family's engagement in the participatory photography exercise. And perhaps, as you can see, the family has mapped its orientation beyond the shelter with the urban landscape, with the stray dog, with, different kind of plants and the canal, the roadside verges, so all these different spaces. When I started to map them and I started to collect the stories, suddenly I found that these are extended domestic spaces, and without these spaces, you cannot really imagine their shelter. The shelter doesn't really make any sense to these communities. And these spaces provide, definitely material resources, but these are also spaces for socialization, opportunities for female householders for gaining social capital, gaining important livelihood informations and knowledges. So in a way, these are really helpful for female householders who are confined to domestic premises because of their many religious and cultural prejudices. And you can see here, these are the 3 different shelters, which in the context of my PhD thesis, I was calling more than human homes. And these are the extended domestic spaces. So, as long as these families can unconditionally enjoy these extended domestic spaces of the urban fringes, they can cope with many limitations that are exacerbated by poverty or landlessness, and cities remain livable for them. And so participants also commented that they may need to move to another shelter because of the changing needs of the patron, or the patron wanted to develop their land in a different way. But they develop long-term, social capital, and sort of like with these spaces, they try to drop their roots in the new urban settings. So sort of these spaces give them a little bit of ontological security that we call the term we use in the housing research context. So my question from this first case study, which was part of my PhD, was, can we call these extended domestic spaces, or otherwise like socio-spatialities, as shadow infrastructures as they help organize and sustain migrants' urban living. So let's deepen the question by looking into this second case study, which is from very close to Dhaka. As you can see from the photo, it's a very dense urban environment. So this is basically from Gazipur, a slum context, which is called Konabari slum. And as you can see, in contrast to the Khulna example, this dense housing site is, if you look into these red boundaries, so these are all aluminum sheds, rows of rooms. Those are rented to rural migrants who actually end up to cities to work in thriving ready-made garments industry and other industries. For example, you can see here, the location of one industry is very close to these places. And the thing is, if you go to the map, these settlements actually continue further down. So one more thing, these particular project, I have a collaborator, Ishtiaq Ahmed, who is now based in Delft University of Technology in the Netherlands. So I was quite interested in, okay, so this is a very different contrast from Khulna. And some of these are spontaneously developed, but this one marked in yellow, this was a new development in 2019, and this had a single owner. And I mean, there is not much spaces, as we could call in our earlier case study, extended domestic spaces. So how these rural migrants, after coming to this dense urban settlement, how they negotiate shelter, what are the differences they make, and can we infer anything that we can call as shadow infrastructure? So that was kind of the question I was asking. So here is the blow up of that cluster. So this is definitely a pre-planned cluster, and so how it works, this is claimed to have under one single owner, but the owner has subdivided the cluster into 11 different linear subclusters that are rented to his close allies or some of the other powerful persons in that particular community. Sometimes they're called gundas. And what happens, these head tenants, they actually rent out and sublet the rooms. You can see here. So here's the typical cluster layout, which holds an average of 23 meter by 3 meter rooms, fed by roughly a meter wide circulation here. And from here on, I'm going to call this circulation spine. So we studied these 11 spines. We did participatory observations. We interviewed people. Obviously, we took photographs. So in some cases, there are some second stories you can see here, which are basically dwelt by those head tenants. And it has a bit of like ventilation and lighting opportunities, but down on the ground level, it's a bit dreadful situation. If you enter the individual rooms, there is no window for natural ventilation and lighting. The door opens only towards the spine, and that is perhaps for many of these rooms the only access for air. So just try to imagine, like, these are aluminum sheds. The temperature around Dhaka in the middle of the summer can be as high of 45 or 50 degrees centigrade. So, and there is no shade because of lack of vegetation. So compared to the other case studies, we are quite interested to see how things work out here. And these are some of the photographs which are quite revealing in a way how the dwellers came to make use of these spines beyond their intended use of circulations only. The apparently inconvenient narrow spines as you can see, became spines of multiple practices. For example, spaces for playing for children, spaces for eating. Even there are also some makeshift cooking spaces, as you can see here. But most importantly, I think what I want to highlight here, like these are the linear gardens that started to pop up, and because there were some successful cases from some of those organically developed spines that we didn't cover in this study, and suddenly these tenants started to develop this kind of vegetations. So what, according to the participants, there are practical benefits. Obviously, we can also infer that the plants sources are good sources of food in some cases, but they also visually soften the hard and harsh appearances of the metal walls and lends some degree of thermal comfort. But beyond material needs, the spines became spaces for socialization and friendship, exchanges of ideas and information. I mean, this kind of improvisations are nothing new in Indian context. For example, Ananya Roy or Amit Roy, they started to talk about these creative interventions as jugaad urbanism. I mean, which is not definitely our focus, but I want to highlight one quotation from a participant. What she was saying, that the tin wall won't move, the window won't get any bigger, but these plants will grow. So will my friendship, so will my friendship with those who trade on these alleys. I mean, that tells a lot of things, and especially if I can recall from, for example, in Amin's term, the spines in this context work in the background to organize, reproduce, and pattern many possibilities that these migrants could otherwise have been restricted from. So that was the second example, and now I'm going to take you to the third example, which is from Sydney. So this is also part of a larger project that I started with Professor Claudio Minca from Macquarie University. Claudio has moved to Italy before COVID. So we started this project to look into how, again, migrants, especially the culturally and linguistically diverse migrants, our focus was on South Asian migrants, and because of my Bangladesh background, it was easy for me to access those community members. So we looked into these three different clusters in the greater Sydney suburbs, and we were focusing on different housing sites, especially the shared housing sites and some of the first home buyer housing sites. But for today's presentation, I'm going to focus on some of the data that I collected from, especially from the Campbelltown City Councils, Ingleburn, Minto, and Lumia, these three suburbs. But the thing is, I mean, this case study, I have very limited data, and I have basically no photographs because we started this in 2018, 2019, but after COVID, the fieldwork stopped. And the thing is, I'm trying to expand, I mean, replicate this research in Dunedin. For example, this is a photograph from Dunedin where you can see the property owner and the tenant family involved in the regular maintenance of the garden as agreed in the beginning of the tenancy. So, and this is again I think the gist from my 20 to 22 interviews that I had done in Campbelltown City Councils, that local government area. So as you can see in this table, like these housing sites are basically a standalone house rented directly from landowners. Some are rented granny flats. So obviously there are on-site landlords or head tenants are over there. And there are also shared housing sites. And these shared housing sites are either, not room sharing, they are basically house sharing or apartment sharing. So what is happening? So who are the actors involved here? So mostly migrant women, that I interviewed some of them, some of the tenants or international students enrolled in those local universities. And as you can see in this right column, these are the different forms of exchanges that are done on a daily basis between these two cohorts. I mean, the migrants and the head tenants, or migrant, tenants and landowners. So these are also informal sites in the sense that these rental sites are negotiated by tenants outside of any formal agreement mechanism. And I mean, travel arrangements to nurseries, riding, car sharing, even sharing of driving skill, babysitting, shared cooking, even some of the, I mean, over time, things happen pretty, I mean, unexpectedly. For example, some of the tenants and landlords started to write books about their gardens. So these are happening beyond the, what I would say, the, I mean, normative or neoliberal property relationships. And some of these things have been already, the narratives have been already discussed by, for example, there is one interesting paper from Ellen van Holstein on, I mean, relational properties in, I guess, she was at that time in the University of Wollongong. So what she was trying to say that this kind of sharing across different plots can actually unsettle the Western way of like how we understand property relations. So, but I think the interesting thing about shadow infrastructures, or what I'm trying to say here, shadow relations, they become, I think they create potentials for infrastructures in that sense, what Emma Power and Kathy Mee has discussed in their paper on housing as care infrastructure, that suggest when care practices and relationships become stabilized and they started to be routinely practiced, they begin to function as infrastructures. So that is kind of the lead where I started to think about, okay, so can we call these shadow relations as infrastructures? So coming back to my proposition of what shadow infrastructure means, obviously, I'm taking inspiration from Power, Wiesel, and May's forthcoming paper on shadow care infrastructure sustaining life in the post-welfare city. So what I'm suggesting in each of my cases, the material spines or those extended domestic spaces or the backyard gardens in Sydney, they bring focus to the shadows that nurture relations of different kinds that cannot be recognized in the within the framing of the dominant monetary exchange values, which also Emma Power and colleagues find similar to those, I mean, that iceberg narratives that was conceptualized by Gibson Graham. But these are important activities that are happening in the shadow, the collaborations that are actually helping the marginal, I mean, migrants and house seekers to hack housing in unequal cities. So I take inspiration from Power and colleagues, and what I'm trying to say that shadow infrastructures that occupy a continuum, including formal and informal, established and impoverished practice, informal community networks and exchanges, some on material supports generated in those extended domestic spaces, in the backyard garden, in the spines, and others are immaterial supports like those women-to-women networking, landlord-tenant covenants, more than human sociality, affect, knowledge, and information flows, friendships, and so forth. So shadow infrastructure are those that support access to those primary infrastructures which were otherwise untenable or unthinkable. So in each case, the shadow infrastructures are helping to negotiate housing situations. So in terms of what constitutes shadow infrastructures? Are there any common threads in the 3 case studies that I presented? Could we generalize anything? So what I propose from looking into my 3 case studies, that 4 things, 4 features: occupancy, relative invisibility, flexibility, and inseparability are key features of shadow infrastructure. So let me describe it. So firstly, invisibility, so occupancy or in situ participation is essential to the formation of shadow infrastructures. You have to make yourself present in those spaces, in those relations, to form those interhuman and more than human contact relations in those contact zones to derive benefit from those support systems. Secondly, shadow infrastructures work better with a certain degree of invisibility. The reason because many of the operating logics may not quite make sense from the outside of those relationships, because sometimes some of these activities are too informal to justify them in legal or regulatory frames, and they only fit in perhaps some of those affective or moral frames or relational frames of those who are part of the networks. So my point here is shadow collaborations may better serve in their sublime or in their darker state. The third thing is flexibility. So shadow infrastructures are subject to a degree of flexibility that help create their own governance or organizing logics in each situation. In each situation, the rules evolve as the occupiers are afforded or based on how they wish to be afforded. So the collaborations extend, they can squeeze, they can stop based on timing, based on the seasonality of the garden. They may also collapse for certain actors when the needs diminish, or for some actors when the tenancy rental contract, the formal contract stops. So now the fourth one, which is the most interesting one to me, and it contradicts with our Donna and my earlier paper on care as infrastructures. So this fourth feature is inseparability, or in Amin's term, propinquity. So to my observation, the critical feature of shadow infrastructure, this is because in our cities paper, we argued for care as alternative infrastructures. But here in these cases, we see that although in many of these relations are built on care and care relations definitely exist, but care relations cannot really produce itself any kind of housing solutions to them. So these relationships need to still align with the kind of primary infrastructures under which these relationships develop. So what I'm trying to argue here, that shadow infrastructures cannot operate in isolation. Both the primary and shadow infrastructures need to be understood as inseparable. Andrew McGregor, my PhD supervisor, and myself, we are trying to, in a separate work, we are calling it a conceptual thickening of certain infrastructural sites or the context that can help us recognize the both, like the overt and the sublime, they can be recognized together. So here in these situations, like the pre-given shelter, for example, the rented room in Sydney suburb, and what are the excesses, the relationships that built around that shared housing sites, all those things needed to be understood together. So these are the 4 features what I'm trying to develop. But as a point of departure, what I also want to highlight that, okay, so what are the significance of understanding or reimagining shadow infrastructures than just care as alternative infrastructures? So what I can think of, like shadow infrastructures give ways for social and sometimes more than social collaborations to help or fold marginalized actors into new constellations with other not so marginalized actors. I think that's the beauty of also caring with, but I think these are also performances and privileges that can come together when we talk about shadow infrastructures. And I mean, some of these communities, they are actually engendering mutual attunement and coordination without the existence of the state institutions or the formal market interventions, which often think we think need to facilitate their capacities, but they actually exclude these kind of actors. So as a researcher on housing, I think shadow infrastructures can generate a broad range of, oscillating practices that are and orientations to access housing. These practices can be understood as housing practices, and in that way, perhaps some of the concepts by Emma Power or Kathy Mee as housing as care infrastructures, they make more sense. And these definitely give opportunity to rethink housing beyond just a material goal, but a platform for playing alternate spatial and infrastructural politics. I think that's all.
Fabulous, Ash. Thank you so much.
Should I stop the sharing, or how do you want, Ben?
Sure, if you like. Yep. Brilliant.
It's gone. Yep.
Thank you so much. Fantastic stuff. Got a little bit of time for questions. If anyone has a question, either feel free to just jump in, or if you would like to pop a question into the chat, I'm happy to read it out for Ash. Choice is yours. No questions. Don't forget to take yourself off mute if you're talking right now. Maybe I'll kick off with a question, Ash. I know I'm pretty sure you contributed to the Shadow Places network. Yes. Concepts, building on Val Plumwood's notion of shadow places, and I can see the parallels between shadow places and shadow infrastructures a little bit here too. I was just interested in whether there's something in particular that infrastructures does that places doesn't do, or vice versa, whether there's something around mobility in infrastructures, or that's a little less bounded sense when you're thinking about infrastructures than places. But I was just interested, given that you contributed to that little project too, and you're building these shadow infrastructures ideas, whether you saw any differences or interplay between those ideas.
Thanks, Ben. The shadow place concept we used to describe home, that was actually there. We were trying to capture the mobility of migrants and their connections to multiple places, and how I think that was the beauty of the concept of engaging with shadow place, because that helps, for example, development practitioners not to incentivize development interventions to only one place, but how multiple places should be recognized as part of the development initiatives. So that was kind of the practical aspect of that particular paper. But here, I'm afraid I didn't really think about the concept of shadow place and how it could perhaps be mobilized in these particular cases, but that's something interesting perhaps in future I need to think about. Yeah, I think we have a hand raised. When David?
Yes, David, go for it.
Hey Ash, thanks so much. That was really good. Give me lots to think about. I was my ears pricked up when you were talking about these relations that sit outside of the state. And I'm wondering, did I conceive of that correctly? Are you saying that a lot of these relationships in these different contexts sit outside of the state?
I think that's a big thing. Perhaps I have, how to say, I mean, if you look into the informal settlements, perhaps not in Sydney's case, but many of the things that do not really make sense to government organizations, they do not recognize. I mean, they are kind of ambivalent about what actually happened on an everyday basis. They do not really want to look at those kind of activities. And in that sense, perhaps it goes, I think, outside of the radar of the state. But yeah, so that's perhaps what I can relate to. Sorry, David, if I haven't responded to you.
No,
Well,
no, it's good. I don't think there's any definitive answer. I think it's something that I think about quite often. It's like, is the state here or not in this situation? And I kind of always think that it is, just in varying intensities and in varying levels of intervention. And perhaps in some of these informal infrastructures, the state sits above as a kind of atmosphere or a pressure pushing down on people, kind of forcing them to dwell in these sorts of precarious situations. But yeah, no definitive answer, but thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions? We had a comment from Iris as well, who I think looks as though she had a similar point to David. Does shadow infrastructure replace housing infrastructure provided by the nation state? So I've had a little bit of a reflection on that, but feel free to expand. But are there any other questions out there? Yes.
I'll ask one.
Maybe.
Hello. Fabulous, Ash. Thanks so much. That was really interesting. I wondered if you might talk a little bit more about methods for looking for or at shadows, or shadow infrastructures maybe specifically, and like perhaps some ways of thinking about how to think about, I guess, epistemologies, I suppose, of shadows. How do we look for those? What are we looking for?
I think that's a super interesting question, and I can recall, I think, some of the papers in progress in human geography that was talking about how we could perhaps do more to I think some of these sublime elements of our everyday life that we cannot really make those things visible only through our verbal engagements with our participants. And I think that is also sort of like relevant in Bangladesh's context. Obviously, I had in the first case, I went with the participatory photography exercise, and it enabled me to understand these shadows. In Sydney context, for example, I didn't really engage with any of those methods. But I think in relation to, in terms of if we want to understand those sites, you need to have access to some of those environments, which can be quite difficult for someone who is not really well embedded within the community. How could actually unpack those relationships? And some of those relationships can be sometimes quite dubious. How you want to talk about that, how we want to report about that. So that kind of reinforces why we should perhaps use multiple, like, performative and also visual, verbal methods, and how we can combine them together to bring those shadows in the light, perhaps.
That's great. Thanks, Ash.
Thank you.
Got a question from Laura.
Hi, Ash. Really enjoyed your talk. Very profound and difficult for me to wrap my head around. So I'll try to frame this as a question. so I was trying to understand the relationship between housing as a concept and as a place in which people live, but it's only one dimension of living. And then these different relationships that you're talking about, which I think if I was to collectively define them, relate to people's actual achieving well-being. And so, so to me, the relationships you're talking about, social relationships, person to person, ways to acquire either physical or emotional support, are broader and not necessarily linked to the housing per se. But I can see that the housing is one dimension of that. So I guess my question is how you see the actual housing component as central to or a part of the broader relationships that are being fostered.
Thanks, Laura. That's a okay. Interesting question in a sense that, I mean, the one paper we published in recently out of our Sydney's work. So we were focusing on the owner-occupiers, like the shared housing premises where the owner-occupiers also live with their tenants. So what we can see, although you are owning the house, but there are certain risks involved and certain relationships that are understood as risky relations within those shared housing sites. And because of them, the owners sometimes feel that they're risking their own home. They cannot attach meaning to those homes, although they're, I mean, on paper, they have the ownership of those housing sites. But in contrast, I think in my today's presentation, I'm trying to sort of like perhaps romanticize some of those relationships. And some of those are also still precarious relationships that are actually revolving around those housing sites. So I think it's more about what you want to take out of these relationships. So there are definitely positive relationships that we can perhaps nurture, and we can cultivate those relationships to think about how housing politics can be done beyond that shelter-centric politics, or I mean, how housing can be rethought as relational and careful sites. So I think that's kind of the, I mean, in terms of relationships, where I'm heading from. I mean, informal housing sites or shared housing sites are always, I mean, traumatized in literature. But I think there are also some good examples that we can also dig out if we actually look into some of those nuances in these relationships and how participants around those sites feel about. I mean, sometimes they can also feel at home without owning a home. So there are interesting discussions from Sophia Malsen, Nicole Guran. They're engaging in that conversation. So, yeah.
Nice one. We are getting towards the end, but we have a question from Emma, who's got a little bit of noise in the background. So I'll just read the question in the chat. Wonder if you can reflect on how you see shared infrastructures operating differently across the Australian and Bangladeshi context.
I haven't thought about that. But I mean, shadow infrastructures are kind of quite obvious, perhaps in Bangladeshi context, because of a lack of. Sometimes you do not really need to understand them as shadow infrastructures, but I mean, in Sydney's context, especially in the housing sites, when the housing sites are tightly bound in those regulatory frames, I think it is quite difficult to establish those moral frames that help unpack those shadow relations. But I don't know where I'm going with this answer, but I think I'll think about that, Emma, but thanks for asking that question, please. Yeah.
Nice one. Okay, well, we might leave it there. I just want to say thanks so much, Ash, for sharing that with us and for kicking off our pep talk series. Yeah, it was fabulous, and we're really pleased that you're able to join us. And what a great way to start the series, and everyone who comes after has a lot to live up to, that's for sure. So
thank you for patiently listening to me, and yeah, I would love to have some feedback at any point of time, because I feel like now I can perhaps talk about how to hack housing through shadow infrastructures.
yeah, right, that's interesting. Next step, well, we'll have to invite you back.
So, yeah, I'm going to join anyway, because I'm not going to miss some of the presentations. I think the next one from Amelia Hine, yeah, so that is going to be amazing. So yeah,
absolutely. No, we're very much looking forward to that. So thank you again, and thanks for everyone who joined us, and keep an eye out for our next one, which will be I think last week of May on a Thursday again. But we'll be putting up plenty of info about that well in advance. But so thanks again for joining us, and thanks again, Ash. Fabulous stuff.
okay, then.